So let's talk now to the man who led the SNP and the independence movement to the 2014 vote. The former First Minister, Alex Salmond, joins me now. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
We're going to get this paper from the Scottish Government this week. Are things moving fast enough from your perspective?
Well, I'm delighted that the Scottish Government are now going to publish papers which adjust the case for independence to take account of all the developments in the world since 2014, Brexit, pandemic, the implications that it has for issues like Europe, currency, borders, etc. I'm not certain why all this work couldn't have been done over the last 5 years, but nonetheless, I'm glad we're about to see the fruits of the civil service labour.
Were there weaknesses in the argument last time round that need to be specifically addressed this time?
No, I think it's much more that the world has changed, Gary. Let's just take Brexit, for example. Back in 2014, in the yes side and the independence side, we envisaged Scotland and the rest of the UK as independent countries being two partners within the context of the European Union. Clearly, that's no longer the case. Brexit has happened, and that has implications for the case for independence. It has advantages in the case for independence because the outlook for the UK looks dismal. The OECD are forecasting nil point growth next year. It's bottom of the league, the sick man of Europe in economic terms, and that emphasises the necessity for Scottish independence and a different economic perspective. But also there's challenges. You've got to come up with the arguments in terms of what it means for borders, how you'll approach Europe, how you get back into the European Union in a reasonable timescale, or is EFTA an option, as the Alapa Party would argue. So these are the things you've got to address. It's catching up with the modern world.
As Lindsay was pointing out there, the one thing we're not going to get anytime soon is this bill on the mechanism for a second independence referendum. Do you understand why there's been a delay in this, why it hasn't come forward yet?
Well, I understand that presumably the Scottish Government are worried that Boris Johnson is going to say no. But I'd have thought you have to kick off that campaign. If you know he's going to say no, you have to let him say no and then do something about it. It's not really a strategy by just not asking the question. You have to ask the question if you're to mobilise a campaign, a political campaign, a legal campaign, a diplomatic campaign to change his mind. I would have thought that this is rather a good time to put pressure on a Westminster government. Boris Johnson's difficulties are Scotland's opportunity.
So what should the plan be in this instance? Because, as you say, the Prime Minister is likely to say a variation of now is not the time, and you had your once-in-a-generation referendum in 2014. Is it a legal challenge, ultimately?
Well, you have to mobilise a political campaign to change Westminster's mind. It's never been the case that a Westminster government would say, oh, congratulations, chaps, you've won an election, we'll just go ahead with an independence referendum. You have to present them with alternatives which are less palatable in order to bend them to the will of the people of Scotland. But remember, we're talking about Scotland. Scotland is not a state, but we're a sovereign nation. We have the right of self-determination. And you'll find that most Scots, beyond the ranks of the SNP or the Alapa Party or the independence movement, most Scots believe that. They believe that whatever they think Scotland's future should be, they believe that that future should be decided in Scotland. So you've got the makings of a very powerful political campaign to bend Westminster to the will of the people of Scotland. But listen, if you're going to run a race, you have to fire the starting gun. Is
one of the best hopes potentially a Westminster election where the SNP holds the balance of power?
Well, that would be one option, but the SNP have pledged that there's going to be a referendum next year. No ifs, no buts. The Constitutional Secretary said that as much in the Scottish Parliament last week, and now he's finished with the census. No doubt he'll be able to turn his mind to it. But that's the promise that's been made, and everybody else in the independence movement must take that at the word, that they have a plan, a strategy to deliver that independence referendum next year. Now, if that doesn't happen, there are alternatives to exert the will of the people of Scotland. But firstly, let's see if we can press Westminster into accepting the will of the Scottish people, and to achieve and to succeed in that campaign, you've certainly got to start it.
We saw some legal advice last week, although it didn't cover the legality of the Scottish Parliament legislating for a referendum. When you were First Minister, did you get legal advice on whether it would be lawful to proceed without a Section 30 order?
Well, listen, you can proceed without a Section 30 order. That's not in doubt. You can introduce legislation, you can pass legislation. The purpose of a Section 30 order is not to allow you to pass legislation, it's to put that legislation beyond sensible legal challenge and to get the acceptance and agreement of Westminster to abide by the result of the referendum. That's the purpose of a Section 30.
Did you get any legal advice surrounding that when you were in charge?
A range of legal advice. I mean, it's well known that part of our strategy back 10 years ago was to persuade the UK government that if they said no to an agreed referendum, that we had other mechanisms in mind. And so obviously we were preparing along these lines. But remember, I introduced legislation for an independence referendum back in 2010. It got defeated then because there was a minority of independence supporters in the Parliament. You don't need a Section 30 order to introduce the legislation. That's why I'm sort of puzzled that we're only 18 months to the end of next year. You would expect that the starting gun to be fired, and I think everybody in the independence movement is looking forward to the start of this race.
Last time round, it was a simple yes-no question. The question will be tested again. We know, of course, in 2016, the Electoral Commission didn't like yes or no when it came to the Brexit referendum. The question became remain or leave. How do you feel about testing the question this time round? Are you sanguine about the idea of it not being yes and no?
No, the question was tested before by the Electoral Commission in 2013, extensively tested. If you remember, the proposed question from the government I led was, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country? And the Electoral Commission changed that after testing to be, should Scotland be an independent country? They made that change after extensive research. Now, the referendum that was held had the highest democratic turnout, certainly in British history, probably one of the highest in world history. I mean, 85% participation. There was no suggestion that people didn't understand the question. I mean, that wasn't a problem with the referendum at all. So I'm puzzled as to why anybody should think you need to rerun the testing that was done 10 years ago, given the overwhelming success in technical terms of the first referendum. I mean, it's unimpeachable in terms of the people's understanding of the question, their participation in the ballot. Unimpeachable. So why on earth would you want to test it? And remember, the Electoral Commission would take 6 months to retest the question. I'm just puzzled as to why you should want to do that.
You've been quite vocal recently about what you see as the failings of Nicola Sturgeon's leadership. You were reported as saying the SNP Green Coalition are using independence as a shield for problems of policy delivery. How can you say that the government's fit to take Scotland to independence if you say it struggles to deliver on domestic policy? They can't run the trains or the census properly.
Well, these things are all relative, of course. I mean, we put a great emphasis in 2014 on the policy performance of the Scottish Government, and it wasn't even an issue in the 2014 referendum. People accepted that the Scottish Government done a grand job of running the devolved functions. But these things are relative. You compare the Scottish Government to the Westminster Government, and whatever problems in policy performance, and they are quite substantial in the Scottish Government at the present moment, they are as often not compared to the incompetence and corruption at Westminster. So people look at these things in the round. They look at how the Scottish Government's doing, and then they look at the black hole of Whitehall, and they take and make their own conclusions.
Well, you've already alluded to the difficulties at Westminster. Ian Duncan made the point earlier as well. Given everything that Boris Johnson is facing, the polls on independence still seem pretty static. What's it going to take to shift it?
Well, it's static at 50-50. I mean, the Moray poll last week had 50% for, 50% against. When we kicked off the independence campaign in 2012 with the Edinburgh Agreement, I mean, support for independence was 30%, not 50%. And therein lies the answer. I mean, if you want to increase the support for Scottish independence, then you have to campaign for it. You have to campaign for a different perspective. You've got to say things like, look, Scotland has a third of the UK's resources, natural resources, with 8% of the population. We have the ingredients of economic success. That is a talented, skilled population and cheap, abundant and environmentally clean supplies of energy. These are two massive advantages in the modern world. You have to get into a position where you can argue that case. And you get into that position by firing the starting gun and starting the independence campaign. Then if your case is strong enough, you'll increase the support for independence, as we did between 2012 and 2014.
Is Nicola Sturgeon the right figurehead for this campaign, given that you believe she's been dragging her heels?
Well, when Nicola's been elected as the head of the Scottish Government, inevitably she'll lead the independence campaign. Listen, there'll be no problem with unity in the independence campaign once the starting gun is fired. The elements of disagreement in the independence campaign are people's doubts and question marks as if we're going to have that referendum or that electoral test next year. But that's been promised, no ifs, no buts. Let's go forward on that basis. But once that starting gun is fired, once that starting gun is fired, then the independence campaign will unite.
Do you see a role for yourself?
Well, I mean, I've argued for independence all my life, and I'll continue to argue for it. And I look forward to a referendum campaign when I'll be able to argue for it more. I'm currently touring the country, and we Alapa book meetings, the new perspective for independence that the Alapa Party, a small political party, published some months ago, and there's a huge an interesting and enthusiastic reception at these grassroots meetings. I'll be continuing to do that. I'm just waiting for the campaign proper to start.
Not translated into polls at the polls, unfortunately, for you. You stepped down as First Minister, of course, when you failed to deliver independence. If there isn't a referendum at the end of next year, for whatever reason, is that time for Nicola Sturgeon to call it quits?
Well, I stepped down as First Minister, and I think, Gary, to answer your question about polls, the SNP in the Moray poll of October 2014 were on 58% of the vote, and my personal rating was plus 35. So people, whatever they voted,
a lot of water under the bridge since then, of course.
Well, yeah, of course there are. But all I'm saying is people judged the performance of that SNP government very favourably. Now, what people want to see from Nicola Sturgeon, whatever disagreements there are, they want to see that independence campaign start. So rather than say what happens if it doesn't start, let's look forward to that campaign starting, the referendum being delivered next year, and all of us in the Yes movement being able to unite behind that banner.
Are you confident of victory?
Yes, I think the case for independence is even stronger now than it was in 2014. That's because Scotland's potential. We're now in a world where resources are king. I mean, resources are not everything in economics, but the substantial part of economics, and Scotland is overflowing with natural resources. You put that with a talented, skilled population and re-establish our trading relationships with the rest of Europe that have been sabotaged by Westminster, you've got the ingredients of economic success. And meanwhile, the United Kingdom economy is the sick man of Europe in terminal decline. So the contrast between the disarray and the dead-end politics of Westminster and the opportunities in Scotland is even greater than it was in 2014. But that case has to be articulated in the reality of a campaign.